Professor Joan Cummings, thank you so much for joining me today on American Dialects.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So first I want to start with Syria. You worked in the US Embassy in Syria when the uprising started. What were the internal discussions and reactions within the embassy regarding the protests?
It's a very good question because in many ways we were trying to sort out for ourselves what the dynamic within the country was, because there was a surge of feeling, and of course we were in contact. We were talking with lots of different people, but the initial interest in Arab Spring in Damascus was mainly discussion, because the government is quite repressive, and it was, people initially felt it is impossible to go out in the street, and then when they started going out, they were arrested and brutally treated very, very quickly as soon as they stepped out. So it took quite some time for there to be an observable swell of street protests. And this is one of the things that we were trying to make sure we got right. We were trying to understand, because the diplomat has kind of two roles depending on where you are and what you're doing. But one of the most important ones is accurately understanding what's going on in the country where you are, and explaining it to Washington so that Washington can hopefully use that information to shape better policies. And then, of course, if you're working in Washington, you're trying to take this in and do the same thing. We also are trying to make sure that we are addressing and explaining American policies as clearly as we can. So in the case of Syria, there hadn't been a very good relationship for several years with the government of either Hafez al-Assad or Bashar. And so we had to be rather careful who we spoke to. And remember, this is coming right after the WikiLeaks. And so we were also very concerned that people we spoke to were not disadvantaged or put in danger by the fact that they're talking to us. So what we observed at the beginning was that much of the initial thinking was simply that we want to have freedom. We want, we, like the other countries, we want to have freedom. We want to have democracy. We want to have these things. But when I would talk with people, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? Well, it's to be free. What does that mean? And people hadn't really gone past we want to be free of the oppression. So I think one of the challenges that the opposition faced in those early years was, just like in other countries, when you have an autocracy, you tend not to have an organized political opposition. People have not had a chance to flesh out what they think, to create structures, to have platforms. And it was difficult for them to really shape themselves into parties, into some sort of productive organization. And at the same time, Bashar was trying very hard to kill anyone who might be able to help them do that.
Mm. And what kind of position the US wanted to take on that at that time, in terms of, do we want to go there in the streets and help the protesters and also try to unify the opposition leaders, or try to bridge this political gap that you've just described in the process in Syria?
It's almost difficult to talk about. It's difficult emotionally to talk about it, because the dynamics of being a diplomat is often that we see something in the field very, very clearly, and we're trying to convey this to Washington. and we represent the government, whatever the administration is. When Washington says we consider our broader interests to not be in line with what a particular embassy is just suggesting, then we really don't have the ability to force through that view. So we saw clearly that there was an opportunity for people who were stepping out into the street, who were trying to create something different. There was an opportunity for the United States to say, we do hear you.
Mm.
And I think we conveyed that. What became a problem later on, and I don't claim to know what the right way would have been, was when there was actual conflict, many of the protesters were angry that the United States did not come in more forcefully on their side.
Mm.
On the other hand, when the US comes in forcefully on somebody's side, it's not necessarily going to achieve the long-term results that either they or we want.
And you were clearly, I mean, the US was clearly on the side of the protesters. And I remember Ambassador Robert Ford going to Hama, and that was a turning point, I guess, because a lot of Syrians now felt that the US is there to support them in this fight and we're gonna win. But I want to hear from you. Did you agree with him, doing these visits?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Working with Ambassador Robert Ford was a pleasure. A very insightful person, and I have a great deal of respect for him. I did agree, and I did kind of honor him for taking strong steps to make it clear where we stood. I think that since it was not something that the US created, and I want to put that to bed right up front, we were working to understand it as the people themselves were working to understand what they were trying to create. So there was no clarity really on anybody's side. It was a very dynamic situation. We were not sure initially what Bashar himself was going to do because, I think there was an opportunity at one point for him to decide to come out as the hero and say, I hear you, my people, and I'm going to get rid of all these bad advisors and I'm going to be a different person. Obviously, he did not choose to take that stand. But I think Robert did exactly the right thing in trying to make it clear that the United States was interested in talking to actual people, not just analyzing it through the lens of what the officials were telling us.
And were you with him when he went to Hama?
No, I went to Hama separately. I was not with him on that visit. I was the head of the economic section. So I often had political meetings when people would feel they could talk to me because they could tell the mukhabarat that they were doing it about sanctions. So they would talk to me about sanctions for 5 minutes and then spend the rest of the time talking about how much they hated Bashar.
Let me ask you, when you left Syria, how was your feelings? And did you feel the US let down the Syrian people at that point?
It was devastating to leave and see how badly things were going. When you say the US militarily supporting the opposition, the frustration that many in the opposition had was that we weren't. There were areas where we were helping in some small ways, but when you look at as the opposition was actually successfully holding territory against the Assad government, and Russia coming in with aerial bombardment to support Assad, because of course they wanted to keep him in power. That was the kind of military support that some people felt the United States should have done. And that's what I was referring to earlier when I said it would not necessarily have worked out well. But the United States did not do that. And I think sometimes people get confused because we have had military engagement in northeast Syria against ISIS later, but the fight against Daesh is completely separate from anything to do with Assad. Do I feel the United States let down the Syrian people? The Syrian people is not just one thing. Do I feel that the United States should have done more to support the movement against Assad? I do, because we watched people being hurt by a repressive government. But as we can see in the world today, the United States government is not always very good about supporting people against harm and damage and attack. It's something we struggle with.
So looking back at the President Obama failure to enforce the red line, how do you feel about that?
I'm frustrated with Congress because I think President Obama recognized that taking some sort of military action without broad bipartisan support in Congress would make it difficult for there to be a continuing coherent policy. And from the beginning, there were enough people in the government, in Congress, who are, well, we don't know who these opposition people are. We've heard that they're Islamists. We've heard that they're extremists. We've heard, and so there was a lot of misinformation, I would say, being put out about who the people were that were calling for Assad to go. That made it much more difficult for the United States to have a firm and clear policy, because we had these different voices in Washington.
So the Congress was the reason, not President Obama, because I feel he didn't want to do that, didn't want to strike.
Well, he's the one that had set the red line. So, clearly he had the, but I know that our version of history since then has been that he didn't mean it and he didn't intend to. But at the time, what he was doing was saying, if we are going to take direct military action on this, we need to have backing, because otherwise we're going to have a sort of fight within the United States with people dividing about what we should do in Syria, with some people supporting Assad and some people supporting the opposition. But and that's not going to be productive. Go ahead.
When you were trying to explain to the administration, while you were in Syria, trying to explain to the administration the situation there, did you feel that they understand and the visions are aligned between you and the embassy and the others in Washington?
Washington is not just one thing. And even though the president is responsible for shaping foreign policy, this is something that I work with my students on a great deal. It is a matter of bringing together a lot of different voices in Washington who see different parts of the problem. So the president is talking to the State Department, is talking to Department of Defense, is talking to the Agency for International Development, other security agencies. So the president is shaping a policy and a response that is going to be something we can implement.
Mm.
When you look at, well, yes, it was the president's policy that we supported the opposition. That does not mean there were not people in the legislative branch, which is an entirely separate branch of government, who were not in favor of the opposition and saw Assad as being a better person. You need to have a strong man to control a mixed up country. All of these arguments were, in fact, arguments that were being used in Congress against supporting the opposition. Not that they liked Bashar, they were just more worried about the opposition.
So moving to your post as a foreign policy advisor to military leaders in Iraq and
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan, what was that experience like?
Well, as you can imagine, it was fairly interesting. It's not a standard diplomat experience. The point of having a foreign policy advisor for a military commander is that there are both aspects of a particular issue that have implications and dynamics that are beyond sort of a narrow military. What is it we're trying to achieve, and what's the best way to do it? And I'll come back to that. But there's also the fact that the military, in what it's doing in the field, and Department of Defense in Washington, are engaged with other parts of the government. And that is one of the things also that I would do, is making sure that everybody is linked up in talking about issues that may have broader implications. So, simple example, and it's a theoretical, I'm not giving you a specific one, but I have seen this multiple times, is if there's going to be a military action, there are ways of doing it that will be consistent with the overall goals that we have. So if we say what we want is for there to be eventual reconciliation of all the groups in whatever country we're in, and we want there to be rebuilding, and we want all good things. If we do a military action in such a way that it enhances domestic divisions, or it creates damage that is going to be harder to be resolved, that's not consistent with our long-term goals. I wasn't always successful in sort of bringing those issues over straight military concerns, but it is one of the things that was my role. And there were absolutely times when I was able to say, well, if we have a choice between A, B, and C C is going to actually hurt us in the long run, and A is going to help us, let's choose A. So there's a very important role for somebody to be there who's looking at those implications.
So which year were you in Afghanistan?
That is quite a while ago, actually. That would have been 2011.
And then when you look back at the withdrawal from Afghanistan, if you could have advised President Biden on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, what would you have said?
Well, let's start off with who agreed to the withdrawal and to the pace of it, and that was President Trump. So, we can get caught up on the process of the withdrawal itself, but at that point, it was a done deal. I mean, it's kind of like, focusing on having the baby rather than how the baby got started, and that matters too. I think that it was a lot of things were not perfect. A lot of things were damaging. A lot of things can be criticized. I'm not sure that there was the possibility to do it better. And I know that immediately I would get pushback from a lot of my military friends who would say, well, we should have kept Bagram, because then we would have controlled the airport and we could have brought planes in and out, and we could have been much more organized about it. But President Trump had agreed that we were going to draw down numbers and we weren't going to bring more troops in. And in exchange for that, the Taliban were not going to attack us. In order to do it from Bagram, number one, it would have meant bringing a lot more troops in, which would have meant the Taliban would have said, okay, deal's off, we're going to start attacking again. So that's one. The other thing is that Bagram is not where the people are who needed or wanted to leave. So I don't know if you're aware of the geography, but the road between Kabul and Bagram is not a long one, but it is definitely one that provide lots of geographical opportunities for people to attack anyone who's on the road. So I think that if we had told people, find your way to Bagram, and we're all safe and we'll take you out on planes, we would have seen an absolute bloodbath on the road. Mm-hmm. So those two things need to be factored in. It wasn't going to get better by staying longer. The best time to leave might have been some years before.
So you don't think that President Biden was responsible for the failure there?
I don't think there was a success possible.
Wow.
I mean, if you're asking me to say, well, if we had just done this, it would have been so much better. I don't think that's an option. I don't think there was a way that it was going to be done better. If we had had more diplomats, if able to process people, if we had had more troops able to control the surroundings, but we didn't, and we had been locked into that by the previous administration. So no, I'm not going to say, well, Biden had the opportunity to do everything perfectly and he just chose not to.
So Ambassador Luis Moreno said about you, her sage advice to U.S. commanders on the ground in Iraq during efforts to contain ISIS expansion was crucial to our efforts there. Can you tell me more about your work as an advisor to the Joint Task Force Against ISIS? I think it was from 2018 to 2020. It was your recent post.
That's right. I was there for 2 years, and it's interesting because the first time I went to Iraq was in summer 2003, and the last time I was there was in 2020. So I saw a span. Interesting. My husband, whom, as you know, died recently, had taught at the Jesuit school in Baghdad from 1965 to 1967. He saw a very different Iraq and actually came back in 2006 as the representative of the World Bank. Mm-hmm. So he was able to talk with people about sort of that span of time, because many people who were in the government had been to the Jesuit school. And I found the same thing graduating from the American University of Beirut. You know, you travel around and people who are my age often had graduated from AUB. Those connections do matter. So working with, as we say, CJTF OIR was I was less conflicted, because fighting against Daesh is kind of something most people agree with. Mm-hmm. And we had a coalition that really wanted to be there. There was no arm twisting. And the command group was generals from many, many different countries. We had government people and parliamentary people from many of the participating countries coming in to talk to people, to talk to their own troops, to see what was going on. So I think that it was a good thing. The challenge I think we had, well, several. One was that people in Iraq who fundamentally were not fans of the United States tried to describe the presence of US troops that were helping the government fight Daesh as a continuation of the occupation. The occupation ended in 2011. We didn't come back for several years, and it was specifically because the Iraqi government went to the Security Council and said, help, we are being overrun. So we did not have bases that the US set up. We did not go along the road in convoys that, you know, wouldn't allow people to pass. We weren't doing any of that stuff. But there were the conflict that we, or the challenge that we faced was that there were still people who strongly resented there being any American presence at all. And then you get into, well, okay, you're striking us and we have to defend ourselves. This was one of the things that I tried to speak to most strongly, because if you get caught up in a tension that is not about the reason you're there, when you're engaged in a tit for tat on a separate issue, then you're never going to win. And I think we faced that in Afghanistan. And I think that that was one of the tensions in Iraq. I don't think that we generated that tension by coming in to fight Daesh, but we were then caught up in it, and there was no easy way out. So I think that there are areas of nuance that we did not deal with well. On the other hand, and this is what happened in Iraq, when there is an attack from a group on Americans, Americans are going to view that as a hostile group, a group that is hostile to the United States and has an interest in doing Americans harm. It's very hard then to talk about why it's happening and what the thinking may be behind it. I did do that, but you're engaging then in a who did the provocation and who is doing the response type of argument that frankly is very hard to unravel.
So the United States is expected to withdraw from Iraq in, I think, in the next 2 years. Do you support that?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the Iraqi government is capable of handling the remnants of ISIS that are there. That's the only reason we were there.
Okay. And moving to Iran, you went to high school there, right?
Yes, I did.
Tell me
My
about
high school was mostly Iranian students.
that. Can you tell me more about that experience?
Absolutely. It was, I love the country of Iran. I mean, as I mentioned, I've been in and out of there since I was very young. I have traveled all over the country. My father is a geographer, so believe me, we traveled all over everywhere. And it is a sadness to me that very few people who in the United States who are making policy decisions about Iran have been there. We do not have an embassy there. We do not have, other than a few tourists, we don't have Americans who have a sense of Iran on the ground. I mean, part of what I think we miss is that Iran is a large country. It's varied in its people, but it has agricultural land and industry and water and big deserts. It has technology. It has highly educated people. It is very difficult to simply shut down Iran by saying, well, we're not going to trade with you, or we're not going to allow you to use the financial SWIFT system, because Iran could survive on its own. Not the way it wants to, not with the quality of life it wants to. That said, the government of Iran is, in my opinion, very deleterious to the people of Iran. I do think that, oddly, Iraq was, I apologize for the noise. I have someone mowing a lawn next door. If we look at the timing, and we remember that the Iranian Revolution was in 1979, and then Ayatollah Khomeini came back, he was not universally at all accepted, and he was criticized by Iranian religious leaders because his particular approach to interpreting the role of a religious leader of a country was so far off anything that was standard. But Saddam Hussein invaded, and first Iran came around, they rallied around the flag, they came together because they were being invaded. The United States supported Saddam because Iran had occupied the embassy. 8 years of war enabled Khomeini to consolidate his power in Iran. I don't think anybody was taking the steps they were taking in order for that to happen. I don't think that was anybody's intention. But the fact of it is that that war enabled Khomeini and his government to become simply standard, as opposed to a very strange creature who might well have been himself changed with a more balanced government coming in.
Why the US doesn't have, a clear strategy?
I think one of the main reasons is because we tend not to understand Iran for many of the reasons that I just mentioned. It is out there, it is an enemy, and so people will study lots of details about it, but we don't particularly understand Iran or Iranians. I think also the degree to which we are able to look at, could we have a different relationship that would be productive in reducing threats, depends on how we see Iran itself linking into other issues that people care or speak very strongly about. So, for instance, because at least until the last several months, there has been a sort of bipartisan, very standard across administrations support for the state of Israel, to the extent that Iran was supporting and funding groups that were hostile to the state of Israel, Iran was going to be the bad guy. And I think Iran very deliberately positioned itself that way because that is something that it could use to convince Arab groups that it was on their side. So I think there's a certain hypocrisy in Iranian support on that. But the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was, I think, one of the rare times that we just looked at Iran. We just tried to figure out what is a policy that is going to reduce the threat that comes from Iran, that reduces the likelihood that Iran is going to develop the ability to produce nuclear weapons and all of that. I think it was absolutely the right thing to do. But then, of course, we withdrew from it.
But, there's some countries, like the Gulf countries, they're saying that, okay, you're reducing the threat of nuclear Iran, but their aggressive activities in the region are still there. And there's, nothing in that deal that understand and appreciates the dangers that those countries were feeling.
Absolutely true. The deal was a nuclear deal. It was about nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
It was a deal that several countries, including Iran, negotiated.
Mm-hmm.
You can negotiate a deal that includes everything, but then you won't have a deal because Iran will not agree to that deal.
But you didn't.
So when you're doing negotiations, you need to look at what is possible, and then you can do other negotiations on other issues.
Mm-hmm.
But to say, well, we refuse to talk unless you agree to everything we say is not conducive toward movement forward.
Moving to Yemen, and I remember you said, before we record the interview, that you always go to places or countries where wars are there. So tell me about your time in Yemen.
But again, I've spent so much time in the Middle East. I had seen Yemen at different times. I had been in Yemen at times when you could just rent a car and drive around the country. So, again, when we look at countries as the people in them, it's very easy to really love them. Mm. And I was delighted to be in Yemen when I was. When I went, Arab Spring had happened. Ali Abdullah Saleh had agreed to step down. Unfortunately, the wording on that had not been phrased carefully enough because he agreed not to run for president again. He did not agree not to try and influence politics and manipulate people again. And he certainly did that. But I was present at the national dialogue almost every day, talking with people, understanding the different views, sitting in on their negotiations, not running them, but sitting in on them to really understand what the goals of different groups were. The dialogue was really kind of amazing because everybody participated. Everybody was there. You had the Salafi party there. You had the Houthis, Ansar Allah there. You had everybody was there. And it's not that there weren't arguments, but they were sitting in rooms and talking to each other. So it was a time when there was a sense, we might really pull something out of this. But at the same time, when I'm having individual meetings with some military figures and some tribal leaders, what the best way I can express it, and this will work for people who focus on the region. When I arrived, people talked about, well, I'm Shafi'i, he's Zaydi. When I left, people were talking about, he's Magus and Rafida, and he's Takfiri. So a huge escalation in this very divisive language, this hostility that changes a fact of different sect, Shafi'i and Zaydi, to a belief that this is somehow formative and creates enemies. When you see that happening, it's much harder to say, hey, let's just resolve things.
And what do you think, what are the factors that led to Houthis taking over?
I think there are two. There are many. I think two I'll mention. One is that even though the Houthis engaged in the national dialogue very actively and fully, they had not been among the signatories on the UN managed agreement. When the National Unity Government was formed, some of the people in Islah said, we don't want to have the Houthis in it, and the excuse is that they were not signatories to the agreement. So you had a national unity government without a key population in the nation. There was enormous resentment about that. It was expressed. There was an effort to negotiate changes, but there was a rejection on the part of Islah for Houthi engagement. So you have the Houthis being frustrated, and you have a loose cannon, Ali Abdullah Saleh, wandering around being angry that he was not in charge anymore. And after doing 6 wars against the Houthis, he went to the Houthis and said, oh, you're frustrated? I'm frustrated too. I am simplifying. The problem is that there were still military units and bases that felt themselves to be loyal to Saleh. So as the Houthis were moving south, Saleh was handing over weapons and material to the Houthis from the bases that were loyal to him, because both of them were angry at Hadi's government. I think that that's a major factor in their ability to take over as much country as they could so quickly. While I have an understanding of the roots of Houthi frustration, I do not in any way accept what they have been trying to do in the country. And it's I think important to note that there are Zaydis that are part of the opposition to the Houthis, and there are non-Zaydis who are part of Ansar Allah. So it is a political division, even though the leadership presents it as being, far more based on a particular identity. It's heartbreaking for Yemen.
Do you think what is needed, like in few words, what is needed to have a more peaceful Middle East?
I think there are several core issues. One is the increasingly hostile relationships that are divided by religious sect. One is the role of Israel. One is, I think, the role of tangential parties like Turkey and Iran. And then, of course, you have the United States and China and Russia. So the fact that many groups have been angry at Israel for what they consider to be an unjust occupation of Arab territory and expulsion of Palestinians, and now, of course, the massive killing in Gaza and West Bank and Lebanon. As long as that's going on, I think it's very hard to even talk about a broader solution. Everyone recognizes the danger of all of this becoming increasingly regionalized and internationalized. As long as that is going on, as long as there's not movement toward a recognition of more than one national right, territory to be determined, then I don't really know how you move past it, because that emotion and that rhetoric is going to be so strong that it just drowns out everything else. In terms of Iran and Turkey, I think that they have national goals. Whether or not we like individual governments and what they do inside their own countries, they have national goals. I think recognizing those, and particularly for the United States to engage with both countries as rational actors, and we often tend to say that any country we don't like is not a rational actor, which is simply not true. We just do not necessarily understand the fundamental assumptions that people are working on, and it's entirely rational within that. The I am concerned that the Middle East once again is becoming a bit of a playground for great power politics, where the United States is taking one side and Russia's taking another side, and China is gloriously happy trying to disrupt both. When you have people, and I, to an extent, I include the United States in this, who don't have a comprehensive policy toward making things better in the Middle East, but are focused primarily on blocking somebody else, it's like elephants dancing. A lot of small animals get hurt.
Professor Cummings, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. I've enjoyed our conversation.